I'd like to welcome everyone to this event. We have representatives from the Embassy of Germany. We are also expecting the Algerian ambassador. Welcome, Dean Sayegh, and welcome everyone, Mr. Ibrahim Khouri, everyone. Just a short glimpse about the history of the Institute of Financial Economics, and then I'll give the floor to Dr. Makdissi, who's going to be the moderator. So the Institute of Financial Economics was formerly known as the Institute of Money and Banking, as many of you know. It was created in 1984 due thanks to the efforts of Dr. Makdissi and 5 leading banks, basically Audi, BLF, Blam, Biblus, and Crédit Libanais. So it was an endowment that helps us do all the work that we do, research. And then we have a working paper series that we've been publishing for many years, and you can see that on the website. You have access to all the series. We've also launched recently a career conversation series, which is aimed to link our students with AUB alumni business leaders. So next Monday, for anyone who's interested, next Monday is the first lecture. We're hosting the chairman and the general manager of Seduce Bank, Fadi Asali, and he's going to give a talk to students about his career path and his successes and failures and so on. So we've also launched a symposium series on economic policy, and this is the first talk. So basically, this series focuses on discussing current national economic policies and their goals, evaluating recent policy interventions, as well as assessing their impacts on economic outcomes such as employment, inflation, and so on. So this is our first talk in the symposium series, and it is entitled Addressing Lebanon's Fiscal Deficit. We have with us 3 experts on this topic. Dr. Makdissi will be presenting each one of the speakers, so I'll give you the floor, Dr. Makdissi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila. Permit me just in the matter of have some observations as a prelude to the discussion by our distinguished panelists today. I have some 5 observations to make as background to the discussion that will be held on fiscal deficits, addressing fiscal deficit in Lebanon. Of course, my first observation is that the reason there have been many writings, many commentaries on this subject, some of which have sort of given a touch of optimism, others a touch of pessimism on what's happening in Lebanon. So we thought that this is really a subject that ought to be addressed objectively, realistically and objectively by 3 experts that we have today on the panel here. Now, as of the end of September 2017, the ratio of the public debt to GDP was hovering around 150%, but it was higher in previous periods. So there are challenges that ought to be faced, that the authorities have to tackle very seriously. And therefore, it is not surprising that the question today, how to tackle this issue, is of extreme importance, which brings me to my second observation, my second comment, why this, the title of this panel, why the fiscal deficit. The title, fiscal deficit, is simply I thought I was not reading well.
You were doing great.
The reason why this is called addressing the fiscal deficit, it was chosen precisely to draw attention to the fact that this is the fiscal deficit where the story begins. When this deficit is under control, the policy options of the government widen. They feel freer in pursuing various objectives, various policies to stimulate growth, to attain financial stability. Equally importantly, the central bank will be freed from having to devise measures and steps in order to counter the monetary implications of fiscal deficits. Therefore, as a third observation, measures to control Lebanon's debt dynamics have been identified, both inside the government and by outside researchers and speakers and commentators. This is not an easy task. Controlling Lebanon's dynamics is not an easy task, but it is an attainable task, whatever the existing bureaucratic and other obstacles. In this connection, why am I saying it is attainable? Because we have to bear in mind the well-established resiliency of the Lebanese economy and the fact that the public debt is basically owed by residents, not by foreign entities, which has provided the opportunity to the authorities to devise ways of meeting present fiscal obligations without having the sort of immediate obligations to foreigners that they have to meet, as has been the case in other countries. And therefore, it will help tackling and devising ways to control internal debt dynamics. I'm sure Dr. Bifani will be giving us, will be throwing light on this issue. My fourth observation is that the higher the level of fiscal governance, the greater are the prospects for attaining the objectives of financial stability. Now, when I say fiscal governance, immediately, what does one think about? Our political class. Our political class that has generally been uncaring, irresponsible, I take responsibility for saying that, or insensitive when it comes to the public interest. Though to be fair, there are exceptions. But even here, it would seem to me that the political actors may have come to realize that they all face the same national economic destiny. If this is so, then one would hope that it would permit implementation of sound fiscal measures that will take some time before they bear fruit. Which brings me to my last observation, namely that in the world of finance and economics, as you all know, expectations play a very important role. If the perception grows that credible fiscal and financial policies are in the offing, this in itself will prompt a positive change on the part of both investors and savers to the benefit of the national economy. So hopefully that this thing will take place, and I'm sure that Alain will probably be discussing this point. Our distinguished speakers are three. As you know, Dr. Alain Bifani, Director General of the Ministry of Finance, who will first outline the fiscal situation and discuss prospects for the control of debt dynamics. He will be followed by Dr. Youssef el Khalil, Executive Director of the Financial Operations Department at the Bank of Lebanon, who will then discuss how the monetary authorities have dealt with the monetary consequences of the fiscal deficits and growing public debt. And then lastly, we have Mr. Hassan Khalil, co-founder of Pembroke Capital, who will follow up with a commentary on how to best proceed with restoring financial stability. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Bifani to begin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Makdissi. Thank you all for being here. Why the fiscal deficit? Well, because it's an important bottleneck for doing what we need to do. But the first question I'm going to be asking myself is, are we trying to do the right things? Given how poor the fiscal and economic results and management was in post-war years, the deficit, as you know, has become very high, always around the 9% of GDP. And the public debt also has accumulated. And we are, thank you, and we are still living the consequences of, among others, the 40% interest rates that we saw in the mid-90s. And things have not really improved since, because basically the fiscal deficit is still the same, and simplistic views regarding how to bring it under control are always in the field of the debate. We keep hearing about easy solutions like all you have to do is increase collection. Well, collection is increasing by 9% on an average if we take the past 6 years, for instance. Stop corruption, definitely. We shouldn't even be discussing a point like that. Yes, we should, of course, squeeze corruption as much as possible, but there would still be many issues to be dealt with efficiently. Cut expenditure, this is the last one that we keep hearing around. Let's be very careful. What does it mean to cut expenditure? We did it in the past, and it was very unwise. For instance, we decided to stop recruiting. Well, the immediate consequence was that we started taking many contractuals, irregulars, etc. in the public sector, and the cost was even higher than continuing to recruit properly. We also decided to stop spending on electricity, if you remember. Well, the cost has also increased on the government and a lot on the citizen too. And then we decided to stop investing in ICT, and the terrible cost of the economy is very clear to all of us. Unfortunately, the whole public debate is stuck at this simplistic level, and I think we should try to change things in this regard. Lower expenditure / how can we make sure that the pound remains stable? It's very important that the pound remains stable. It's very important not to spend right, left, and center, but there is much more to be done in addition to this. It's not enough to have a stable pound to have increased or better living standards for the citizens. This is one important aspect, but there is still a lot more to do. So the story is a bit more complicated, but remains very much feasible if we do things right. First, a quick diagnostic, and then some true measures. The first point is, well, we have avoided the financial crisis for some time now, which is true. And honestly, there is no reason to believe that any kind of financial crisis is coming in the future. But if we look at the economy, well, we've been in an economic crisis for a very long time. And what are the obvious symptoms? Unemployment, the fact that the purchasing power has been falling for very long, no significant growth, losing talents, the brain drain, and also a very few fast-growing segments in the economy, and finally a deteriorating work environment and governance, and an increased corruption. On top of all, worryingly rising inequalities. If I were to sum it up, I would say that this is the most important challenge that we have ahead. In the public sector, how does it translate those rising inequalities? Well, very simply, people become either corrupt or beggars or missionaires. We have with us today some of those missionaires whom I salute and thank them for their work. But this is what we left for the public administration for a long time. And for the rest of the economy, apart from the public sector, we are in front of a lot of people unable to rise above the line of poverty, and the private sector that is unable to create the required jobs, which means, and the jobs and the value, which means basically that the public sector is always pushed to absorb more and more thousands of people because jobs are needed and they're not available. And we can tell from the increased size of the military forces and the teachers in the public education over the past 15 years. Point number 2 is we have always had a high current account deficit due to the economic model that we put in place, relying on billions of dollars pouring into the system every year. And this was meant to compensate the lack of production and exports. The point number 3 is related to new regional and international developments that are basically burying our model. The first is lower oil prices. And we all know that lower oil prices mean for us lower inflow of capital because of the traditional very high correlation between the two. We also witness nowadays a shift in Arab investments toward weapons, toward military issues. And then we have the wars around Lebanon, which is transforming Lebanon into an island. And of course, there is a fall of investments related to that intra-country in the region. Finally, of course, last but not least, the Syrian war. And the only point I will pick from the huge impact of the Syrian war here is the cash outflows that we are witnessing, on top of all the difficulties and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are needed to deal with a situation like that. And this, all of this, those elements lead to a negative balance of payment, which can be explained very easily if we revisit what I just said. So if we sum it up altogether, we're talking about those three items that have an obvious result, which is, what are those three items? Let me remind you quickly of them. The economic crisis and the inability to create jobs and quality jobs, the negative balance of payment and the problem, the structural problem in the current account, and the natural policymakers' reaction, what should they be? Normally, if we look at those items, the immediate reaction should be, well, we need to increase productivity and we need to strengthen competitiveness. What does this require? And I'm coming finally to the fiscal issues. What it requires is relatively easy to imagine. First, it requires a better governance and a much more healthy business environment. Second, it requires to provide Lebanon with the long-awaited adequate infrastructure. Third, it requires to provide proper safety nets to the economy. Fourth, it requires security, which is very good compared to the region. And finally, it requires to reorganize the labor market. And this is when we take a look at public finance. Where do we find the fiscal space, given our present situation, to secure all of the above, and mainly to secure the infrastructure and the safety nets that are badly required? I'm only talking about those points, but we have to bear in mind also that to secure the security item, it was extremely expensive for the public treasury, of course. So where do we find that, the fiscal space? A fiscal deficit of 9% of GDP, if I may remind, and a public debt of 150% of GDP. Well, obviously, we need to first stabilize the public finance and bring deficit under control, and I will come back to this point. On the longer term, slightly longer term, it's important to start generating primary surplus to decrease the weight of the debt. For now, to pick up on Dr. Makdissi's remarks, things remain manageable, and the ability to continue servicing the debt is here, no worries about that, but the weight is increasing. My third point is that we need to put our house in order independently from oil and gas potential revenue. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is that this seems to be given as the magic solution every single time we raise an issue. Oil and gas will not provide a magical solution. Oil and gas usually is treated in parallel to everything else. And therefore, whatever happens, even if we become the first producer in the world, there is still a house that needs to be put in order. And finally, as I said, we need to have the fiscal space for the needed infrastructure and safety nets. Good, this is what we need to do. Now, how do we do that? We are always hearing again about decreasing some marginal expenditures. This is totally insufficient. Again, corruption needs to be killed, and specifically in public procurement. And there are ways to do that. It's very feasible to have permanent expert auditing prior and post-commissioning, and this should happen. It is not enough to say, well, it went through God knows which administration, and that's it. Number two, critical, but it requires some courage. Revisit the size of each and every administration. Of course, the easy answer was always the public administration is too big, etc. The public administration is ridiculously small. It is 10,000 people altogether. But what is big, for instance, is public education. What is big is the security forces. Those are very big numbers compared to what Lebanon can cope with. Just to give you an idea, we're talking about 10,000 in the public administration, 54,000 in public education, 110,000 in the military. And normally, we shouldn't be in need for all of those numbers. If we revisit the way we are using our human resources, there is definitely a big effort to be made. What happens to those who are not recruited in the public sector? We are banking on the fact that when we provide the environment, the infrastructure, the safety nets, etc., the private will be more than able to absorb this workforce and provide to this workforce a much better level of standard of living. Of course, another point is transparency and fairness in the compensations within the budget. You cannot realize how twisted our system is. You have people in the public administration who are first category civil servants who hardly get as much as a fourth category civil servant in the public education, for instance. But yet everybody says that these people are are favored and the others are not favored. If we go into the details of what someone in the military forces gets, what a civilian gets, and so on, there are plenty of stories that show very clearly that the whole thing has to be revisited in a very transparent way, because we cannot go on issuing laws and legislation based on wrong information. Another point is, for instance, the transfers to EDL. We keep saying that the electricity of Lebanon is losing a lot of money, but what does it mean that a public institution is losing money? The government decides what tariffs EDL should apply, and the government decides whom to recruit or not recruit in EDL, what kind of investments are to be made, and the government is buying the fuel. So basically, the government is the only actor on the revenue side and the expenditure side. So it's impossible for a government to say, well, the company is losing money. No, structurally, you are making it lose money. And this is called subsidies. This is not coming from outer space. This is a subsidy policy that the government of Lebanon has. And the first thing to do when we are facing such a huge issue in electricity is to revisit precisely the tariffs, because the subsidies are given across the board, that those who are in need are hardly a small percentage of those who benefit from those subsidies. Plus, of course, obvious issues like the transmission online, which is reaching levels of losses of about 20%, metering, production, on which fuel do we rely, etc., etc. And then production. Another point is, for instance, the rationalization of education on the spending, on education, health, and for instance, roads and all of that. On education, we have a very high amount for public education in Lebanon. Yet, we compensate everybody who works in the public sector for their children to go to the private sector. I'm not saying there is a good policy here, whether we take the first or the second, but we need to choose. There is a choice here to be made. In some areas of Lebanon, simply to have a road covered with asphalt, there may be 7 different sides that could do the same job. The ministry, the CDR, the fund for the displaced, the municipalities, etc., 7. And this, of course, also needs rationalization. Another point is to provide the required infrastructure. Let's stop saying that we need to squeeze expenditure on everything. There are things that have an immediate return for the economy and for the public finance, and this should be done. We need to have everything with a quick return for the economy done, and we have to spend where we should, not squeeze spending. It's totally different. And then there are bodies to be eliminated or rationalized because they do nothing, because they were meant to do something and they do nothing. And it is not the fault of those who work in those bodies. The government decided to put these people there. And we cannot tell them, well, although you have passed exams and been recruited by the government, you're not going to get salaries. It's not their fault if they have been sent to these areas. All of this requires some redistribution and some tough choices. You know, sometimes we have to face the fact that a public body does not work and has therefore to be eliminated. We need to recruit through normal procedures. It is important to give the public administration its normal procedures again, because this will allow this government, all of the governments, I mean the structure, to find an administration and not anymore people who have an allegiance to a certain political party or somebody else. It is very important to come into the government through normal governmental procedures and not because someone helped you being squeezed in somehow. This will give the whole of Lebanon a new credibility, and this will give the public administration a new life. Finally, or not finally, we need to eliminate small waste, various transfers to various third parties, and also to eliminate the amount of tax money that is given to third parties. You don't realize how much money is collected by the tax administration and immediately given to third parties in the private sector, because this is what law says. So the problem is not with the tax administration, the problem is within the law. And this, of course, has to be eliminated completely. The reorganization of the tax system, since I'm mentioning tax, is very important in favor of labor and investment to the detriment of rent and windfall. And activate bodies that are important for tax compliance is critical, and for tax collection. We keep hearing, let the tax administration do its job, they should collect money from, but let's face it, the tax administration is doing its job. But when we don't have a body for appeals, appeals can lie down there forever. When we don't have a court that is supposed to decide whether we're going to buy the assets of this taxpayer because she or he are not paying their taxes. If it doesn't exist, well, we'll never collect this. So it's really plenty of things around that need to take place. It involves the security bodies, it involves judges, the judiciary system, and others. Higher taxation on a very big number of structures that benefit from laws, decrees, or favoritism. What do I mean by that? When I have a law that is issued for someone to make money, or a decree, it's only fair that this person, moral or physical person, pays more than the average. Let's imagine that we are giving someone a decree to open a quarry, God knows on which mountain of Lebanon. This is not the same than someone who is taking risks, investing, creating jobs, etc., etc. It is not fair that someone would pay 17% and the other would pay the same 17%. When I provide someone from my national good the opportunity to make money, this side has to pay higher taxes than anybody else. And this applies to plenty of taxpayers in the system, if they are taxpayers, which is already fine. And then another point is, for instance, to unify allowances, health, education, etc. You cannot imagine the billions that are spent because there are special schemes given to these groups and not to those groups. and do all of that quickly. And this requires 1 or 2 budget exercises before interest rates climb up on external markets and before we start running after expenditure that we cannot control. The only expenditure that we cannot control is the movement of interest rates abroad. When translated into figures, those measures are more than enough to bring Lebanon back in the safe zone. And coupled with the measures I was referring to in the beginning, to bring our country to well-being, sustainable and inclusive growth, and prosperity. This will bring us and our parents the pleasure of seeing the students of AUB, for instance, around in the coming years, and not treat them as exportable goods, which is something that we do, and sometimes we're happy about that. We keep saying that, great, they're gonna send us money back. Finally, one word quick about petroleum. It is critical from now to put the petroleum story on the right track. We have many choices, but the 2 big choices are, do we treat these assets as assets, or do we treat them as revenue? Treating them as assets mean that we acknowledge the fact that this is the right of every citizen in Lebanon. Those assets belong to everybody. Those assets are not something that is an immediate revenue that I can spend. Those assets are to be changed into financial assets, secured safely in a fund. We call it a sovereign fund, we can call it whatever you want, but it has to be secured as assets belonging to the Lebanese population. This is to be invested, I'm done. And the revenue of this investment is extra revenue, because this is where we generate something. The other temptation, which is, oh, we take this, it is wealth, we translate it into immediate expenditure, we service the debt with that, we reduce the size of the debt. Well, this will simply trigger terrible inflation, Dutch disease issues, and before everything else, it would tremendously increase the rising inequalities I was referring to. Because very obviously, this would mean that all of this wealth belonging to all of Lebanon is being concentrated in the hands of the few who are bearing the Lebanese debt, which is totally unthinkable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I should have said, but I missed, that Alain is a graduate of the HEC in Paris with a major in finance. Additionally, he studied economics at the Sorbonne and math and physics at Louis Le Grand. Prior to joining the Ministry of Finance, Alain worked for several well-known foreign private financial institutions. He also is a former professor at the Saint Joseph University. No wonder he did a good presentation. Our next speaker is Youssef el Khalil. Youssef is the Executive Director of the Financial Operations Department at the Central Bank. This department participates in the implementation of national monetary policy. He is also a member of the bank's Open Market Committee, as well as a part-time lecturer in economics at AUB. Youssef, you're going to be talking about the implications of fiscal policy, of the fiscal deficit for monetary measures and policies, right?
No.
Okay, please go ahead, Youssef.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having given me the opportunity really sitting on this panel. Let me start by reminding us that almost 10 days ago was the 30th anniversary of the Black Monday in 1987, where on a single day, the stock exchange lost twice as much as it lost in the crash of 1929. Now, historians still speculate and ponder, the reasons of that, but a major reason which always comes across is the lack of of an efficient exchange of quality information amongst the major economic players. So I'm very happy really to see that for the last 2 months or so, the Lebanese society, the political sphere, syndicates are putting, on the table issues pertaining to economics. I personally sense that in Lebanon, one major problem that we have is that our economic discourse does not incorporate enough economics. I may say sound economics, but enough economics. So this is one of the opportunities given, to us and here in this room to exchange some quality information pertaining to economics. I will be brief so that we give time to the exchange of ideas or for us to answer your questions. But I have some points I would like to make pertaining to the policy of the central bank with respect to the fiscal deficit. I think all of us would agree that this is an organic kind of relationship. I mean, the budget deficit affects monetary stability, and our policy affects the Ministry of Finance, at least as far as the debt service is concerned, at least as far as economic activity is concerned, at least as far as the ministry's ability to raise more revenues. So yes, it is an organic kind of relationship, and what happens on the fiscal level affects so much and dictates, in some instances, our policy making. Let me very quickly place, and as I said, we will go deeper if you wish during the Q&A session, 4 pillars or so of our policy. Pillar number 1 is for us to, if you wish, always assure a stable currency. Okay? We very often speak of the Germans' trauma with respect to hyperinflation. Well, we Lebanese have our own trauma. Let me remind you that in 1975, the US dollar would trade at 2.5 liras. I don't know how many of you would remember what a lira is, but 2.5 liras. At the end of the war, the same US dollar would trade at 2,500 liras. So you would accept it. You would imagine what kind of a trauma is. We at Banque du Liban, ever since the 90s, have put as a main objective and task for us is to provide for a stable lira. And we did. Ever since the 90s, the lira is trading at a stable price. Pillar number 2, as far as our action is concerned, is for us to provide for a solid banking system. And the banking system, as such, has seen its size grow. Financial assets constitute 400% of GDP. Deposits constitute 300% of GDP. I don't want to dwell on figures to impress also or to market the cause of the central bank. But very importantly, those of you who are more into finance than economics would appreciate that Banque du Liban has, for the last 4 or 5 years, met with the Basel requirements, and more than met with the Basel requirements. The Basel requirements that provided that capital adequacy and solvency ratios would be in the realm of 13% are today in the realm of 16%. So even if we were to be subjected to a degrading as far as our rating is concerned, we would still be able to meet the Basel requirements because, solvency ratios are risk-weighted. So when we are derated, our ratios would decrease. So even if we, God forbid, even if we had to have that, Lebanon's banking system is solid as far as its ability to meet the requirements of the highest, if you wish, entities as far as finance is concerned. 3 is, this third pillar is for Banque du Liban never to allow, as far as we can, of course, a sovereign failure. And Lebanon is one of the rare third world countries that has never defaulted on its sovereign debt. We always prepare the ground, as far as our mandate would permit, for addressing the proper yield curves, the proper interest rates levels, so that sovereign debt is always renewed. And we cooperate a lot with our colleagues at the Ministry of Finance doing that. The 2 structural issues that Alain spoke of and that Dr. Makdissi presented are very peculiar to the budget deficit, to economic stability, as well as to monetary policy. We share with the US 2 twin deficits. Of course, I'm not comparing Lebanon to the US. One is the budget deficit, and second is the current account deficit. So it's very important for us to be very cautious when it comes to setting the proper interest rate so that we attract enough funds to Lebanon to the banking system so that Lebanon is able to afford financing the budget deficit. Remember, if we don't, then we'll have a government default, and that would be a real bad thing as far as Lebanon's ability to recapture the situation, and the current account deficit. If we were not, it means that Lebanon's standard of living would have to decrease. So we are very flexible when it comes to setting our interest rates, putting it, in a very, very simple level. Our yield curve addresses the dollar side of the equation as well as the Lebanese lira side of the equation. So if we were to set a dollar interest rate in Beirut similar to that of the US, the rich who have the ability to move their money would move it to the US. You need to have the proper, if you wish, spread so that depositors and financial investors are convinced to stay in Lebanon given the country risk. So this is to cover the country risk. Now suppose the interest rate on dollars in Lebanon is 5%. If we were at the bank to set interest rates on Lebanese liras at the same 5%, then the Lebanese depositors will put the money in the dollar. So you need to compensate them for the exchange risk that they are taking. And those spreads have decreased so much. As Dr. Bifani was saying, they were in the realms of 40% in the early 90s. Now both added together are in the realm of only 7%. And given the rating of similar countries, I think Lebanon is performing well. If you take Egypt, who has the same rating as Lebanon, Egypt borrows at 18%, whereas we borrow at 7%. If you were to get Turkey, who has a much better rating, if you wish, double B and triple B, some of the countries, they borrow at 12%, we borrow at 7%. Indeed, we borrow at rates that are very close to the triple B, not Turkey, double B, triple B, if you wish, kind of rating. Now, to go back to this, the importance of us attracting funds, local and international funds. We at Banque du Liban feel that the region is passing through a period where they're collecting dollars is going to be a dire affair, given the drop in the price of oil. I'm not saying that international dollars are not abundant, they are, but this region lacks dollars and is going to lack dollars in the coming near future. Biggest example is that Saudi Arabia issued debt of 12 billion. Okay, Abu Dhabi is issuing debt in 3 billion. So of 3 billion. Lebanon, for the past year or so, year and a half, has been, if you wish, collecting foreign exchange to strengthen its foreign reserves position, to be able to finance the current account, and to be able to finance the stability of the lira, because as Alain said again, I mean, confidence is the name of the game, and Dr. Samir said that. So the higher the reserves, the higher the confidence, but more importantly, as far as those of you who care about the functional things, as far as our ability to intervene in the market. Again, I can come back to that as much as you wish. Fourth pillar is for us to assist in economic growth. By the way, this is a mandate of the Code of Money and Credit. The Code of Money and Credit gives us the mandate to assure sustained economic as well as social growth. This is one of the rare, if you wish, codes of money and credit in the world where the responsibility of the central bank is to participate into assuring those two growths. And we've done a lot with all due respect with respect to that. Some of us are more aware than others of the Findex indicator, which the World Bank produces, measuring the inclusion, the financial inclusion in a nation, that is the individual's access to loans and deposits and what have you. Well, amongst the upper middle income countries, the rate of growth of our Findex indicator is the highest and has been so for the last 3-4 years. So some things are promising or something have changed with respect to that. Now, let me respond can I have 5 more minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. Very quickly to some of the nuances that have been addressed on this panel. One, Dr. Makdissi still is my professor. That was my professor when I was much younger. We keep... Okay. You and I were younger. Okay. So one very important point to keep in mind, it's a bit technical, and I'm not saying the situation is rosy in Lebanon, far from that. But when we take a ratio of public debt to GDP equaling 151% or so, we have to remind ourselves what is the nightmare related to a high debt to GDP ratio? Well, element number one is that those holders of debt would not renew that debt, would not repurchase, treasury paper or what have you. Nightmare number two, which is higher, is what if those holders of debt, upon maturity, were to transform their Lebanese pounds into dollars? What happens to our ability to secure a stable lira? Nightmare number three, which is the mother of all nightmares, is what if those people, upon maturity of debt, decide not to renew it, decide to purchase dollars, and to start to get the money out of the nation? That would be, the blow. So, what we have developed, to impress, what we have developed is a concept. I really hope I will be able to convey this idea of what we call market debt. What if we were to exclude from the equation those holders of debt who logically or by law cannot speculate against the Lebanese lira? I have in mind Banque du Liban. Banque du Liban would not speculate against the currency it's issuing. The Social Security scheme. If you were to exclude those holders of debt who cannot and will not speculate against the lira, debt over GDP is in the realm of 91%. Now, in Europe, 91% is not, in some of Europe, 91% is not the end of the world, okay? So it's a good ratio. The shame about Lebanon is that this debt did not go to finance, efficient projects in order for Lebanon to be able to sustain more growth. This is a shame about it, but as far as ratios, it's something for us to keep in mind. Now, the balance of payment, yes, Dr. Bifani was right to say that this is a problem, but this problem is more acute, is more obvious, is more seen ever since 2011, up to last year, where we had to intervene to adjust the situation, and if you want, we can share some ideas about that. But if you were to accumulate balance of payments deficit between 2011 and 2016, you would have a figure of higher than $10 billion. And some people speak of the cost of the Syrian tragedy on Lebanon. One very straightforward figure to announce is this, if you wish, accumulated balance of payment deficit of more than 10 billion. Of course, you have to add to it the opportunity cost of Lebanon not producing as much as it's used to, and the figure could increase to 14 or so. But this is a very important element for us to take in mind. Now, I promised Dr. Makdissi to finish soon. I'm not yet. This issue of what are the indicators, remember the budget deficit we have to finance, the current account deficit that we have to finance, catering for the balance of payment deficit that we have to take into consideration. In a nutshell, very, very simply, what are the indicators we look at? One, the growth of deposits. Do we have enough growth in deposits so that we can finance the fiscal and the current account, okay, especially the fiscal? And more importantly, very importantly, is the growth of non-resident deposits. If we have growth in deposits, local deposits, and non-resident deposits to finance those two deficits, okay, then we are more at ease, and then we are less interventionist when it comes to us issuing new products. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention. I'm more than happy to share more ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youssef. Our third speaker is Hassan Khalil. Hassan is a student of industrial engineering who also studied operations research at Stanford University. Then he moved into the fields of investment banking, assuming high positions in trading and capital markets for Japanese European banks, among others. Since the mid-1990s, Hassan has been regularly active in writing and commenting on Lebanon's fiscal and monetary policies, with frequent, as probably you know, TV guest appearances on Lebanese and Arab TV stations. Hassan,
thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. And I do apologize if you see me coughing. I'm suffering with some sinus infection, so bear with me. I feel very humbled with two distinguished colleagues who made good presentation, but I am more fortunate than they are because they are officials who sometimes are constrained and restrained by how far they can be frank, and I know if they are given the chance, they would be more frank. And especially Youssef now, speech has given me ball points which I didn't have in mind, but he gave me the first ball point which I would like to state there, that the Central Bank of Lebanon is playing a role. I disagree with him that part of the role of money is for economic growth. Economic growth usually is a policy of government. Central bank should be involved with monetary policy, but we encourage the central bank to continue what it's doing, because the central bank is actually filling in for the I don't know, I fail to use words how to describe government functioning here in Lebanon, but the central bank has become not only central bank managing liquidity, monetary policy, Lebanese pound stability, but also encouraging investment, setting up a fund for startups, you name it. He's becoming a Ministry of Economy, he's becoming, you name it, central bank is doing it. It's the only last element in the government which we hope stays strong. I can say I met the governor 3 days ago. I told him when I criticized him many, many years ago, it's not because I hate him, and now I'm supporting him and defending him, not because I love him, but that's the last defense we have in the system. So before I go into also why this subject is of interest to me, I made it my own obsession, because I always fear a day where the poor in Lebanon will not have enough, not only to secure a home, but also enough to be fed on. Now, my two colleagues, one from Ministry of Finance, one from Central Bank, they're doing their job. They're not saying that things are rosy, but under current circumstances, Alain Bifani in the Ministry of Finance is saying, we're trying to do this, 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 and we don't deny that the situation is bad. My colleague Youssef is saying that the central bank, under the current government system, which most politicians don't even know, not they don't care. If you speak to any of the top, from leaders down to ministers and MPs, MPs are disaster. They don't even know what debt to GDP is, including members of the Committee of Finance in the Parliament, and my colleagues know that. So why am I saying this? Is because they are not aware that Lebanon is not a miracle. Many people think a French expert came in 1967 and said, oh, this country is a miracle, leave it as it is. This is the most and the ultimate level of ignorance. United States, with its all glory, collapsed in 2008. Nobody be fooled that the United States did not collapse. The only reason the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe did not declare default is simply because they have the indefinite ability of printing. We don't have indefinite ability of printing. Now, many people said, why are you so pessimistic in Lebanon always? And 20 years, nothing happened. I admit, because when I worked with President Hoss and President Lahoud in 1998 during the first government, with the Minister of Finance, George Korom, we realized that the declared government debt was 17.2 billion, but then we found some hidden numbers here and there. And there are some hidden numbers here and there as well that either central bank know about or not. We don't know. The official figure is around 77, but in our estimate, it could range. I don't know, because nobody knows, because it doesn't include Electricité du Liban. It doesn't include public sector. Some public sectors we don't know. Whatever it is, that we have a serious public debt, and why Lebanon was sustained in a system like this for 20 years, and I was wrong. My theory, I still maintain, not out of stubbornness, I was not wrong. But when we had deposits of 30 billion and debt of 19 billion, we said 2 years of public deficit and the deposits will be drained. We didn't know that with a war in 2000, assassination of late Rafiq Hariri in 2005, war 2006, all Lebanese hate each other. Geopolitically, it's on all kind of volcanic faults, and deposits grow from 30 to 170. So is this a miracle? Yes. And do I speak to economists from IMF and from banks? They say, we don't know how this happened, and we don't know how the Lebanese system works. We have no idea how you can attract deposits. And I can say that deposits come mainly a lot to do with nationalism, You can't believe how many Lebanese abroad, their dream, they make millions and they come and spend $5 million to build a house in his village. Secondly, I think we benefited from a lot of the geopolitical crisis that happened around us, from Libya to Tunis to Iraq to Syria to all the kinds. So we had deposits. And thirdly, we still maintain under the leadership of such, and I vouch for the honesty and integrity of Youssef Khalil and his colleagues, Central Bank, Alain Bifani, and the like of Alain Bifani. But Alain Bifani and Youssef are minority in the government, are very, very minority. I don't even understand how they can tolerate to stay in government. So, let me go to another point that Youssef has mentioned very quickly, and I'll speak quickly in order not to miss any points I would like. Debt to GDP, we're obsessed with it. And we want to manage debt to GDP, and Youssef, as a central banker, wants to show that even if we exclude the debt which is non-transferable, like social security, blah, 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 it's 91. Officially, it's 150. My estimation, we are over 200, but that's irrelevant. Whether I'm right or wrong is irrelevant. Let me remind everybody that Argentina defaulted with 55% to GDP. Japan did not default with 240% of GDP. Why a country defaults and a country doesn't default? Because Argentina is very similar to us. They're lazy, laid back, corrupt, inefficient, and this is our society as well. And this is why Lebanon is at risk, not because Lebanon is at risk because debt to GDP is 150. 150, I can sustain 150 if you can tell me we have an export base, we have an effective industrial base, we have a productive economy, we have an efficient government system, and we have responsible politicians. All of this don't exist. So the debt to GDP is not an indication that if we reduce it to 100, this means we are safe. This country is addicted to consumption. We import $18 billion. Our exports went down from 4 to, some people say, 2.5 billion. I don't trust any of the numbers anyhow. But we are non-productive. We still, as well, even with our, what Youssef mentioned, with our trade deficit problem, we still sign trade treaties where a Euro certificate now enters without duties. Imagine a country that is addicted to consumption with 18 billion of imports. The customs revenue, correct me if I'm wrong, the customs is around $450 million. Am I right in this figure? The Minister of Finance say there is an escape of about 700 million in customs. If the Minister of Finance says that, knowing him, I know it's a minimum double that figure. Okay, so you're talking in customs alone, you're talking about over $1 billion of people not paying. Imagine your custom bill is under 2% of imports. We are a member of a group like the EU, and we have VAT, which compensate. So why am I saying this? Let me give you very, very brief quickly what's my background, why I claim that this is an obsession for me. Because I'm a trader. I was head of trading for many banks, and my trading is emerging market debt, exactly like Lebanon. So I trade Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela, Russia, you name it, from east to west. And I've seen crisis. I lived crisis. I manage a portfolio where we liquidate and we enter and we reduce here and we overweight here. So we have seen tequila crisis in Mexico, 94. We have seen Sweden before Sweden became a model. We have seen Russia collapse in 98. We have seen Argentina in 99, Brazil 2000, Argentina again, or Argentina 3 times so far. Ukraine, Greece, Iceland, Cyprus. People really are fools to think that Lebanon is immune from being one of those. It's either they are criminals or idiots. It cannot be in the middle. And I tend to say they are more criminals. Criminals, because even ignorance does not justify inaction. The fact that when Rafi al-Hariri was alive, I vouch that all politicians supported him in whatever he did, simply because he said, if he succeeds, we supported him. If he failed, that son of a bitch, he caused all of this. So there are such cheap politicians we have in the system that is taking the country to crisis. I'm sure my 2 colleagues will not say that. And, and I support...
Excuse me, Hassan. I said that. I mean, I did refer to that, but
But you didn't use son of bitch.
No, but I would be grateful if you could tell us how to get out.
Yes, I'm coming to that.
Please.
Okay, so the central bank is doing its duty. In maintaining. Central bank is hostage now to fiscal policy. They have no choice but to continue create and engineer instruments whereby to support the fiscal policies so that the country does not default, which is an obsession. The Lebanese pound stability, which is a big question mark in the late 90s, which I was never in favor, but now if you ask my opinion, now I became a hostage to my thinking that I have to support Lebanese pound stability simply, not because Lebanese pound is such a great currency, but effectively there is no Lebanese pound. There is only one currency. This economy is effectively almost totally dollarized, except for some bread you buy in the morning and salaries. The danger of what's happening, which we have to tackle, and Dr. Makdissi has asked me, okay, what do we do? Is I claim that I have done my bit in the last few years without an official capacity, going around to politicians who I have access to, including the president today, and I say we have to do something. Is the situation hopeless? No, it is not hopeless. But what people don't realize is that there is no, politicians by nature are corrupt. Some are corrupt mentally, some are corrupt financially and mentally. What do I mean by mental corruption of politicians? That no politician, whether here or in the West or the East, will make decisions which are unpopular to make him unpopular. So that's why, if you notice, every single minister of finance around in the world, he always takes a target of reducing budget deficit. Only in Scandinavia they talk about balanced budget, and Norway they have a surplus where they build for the future generation. Here, reduce deficit. What do you mean reducing deficit in Lebanon? 9% deficit to GDP is becoming a norm. It used at one time, and also correct me Alain if I'm wrong, at one time we reached sub 20 at one time. Now they reduce it to 9. But what does that tell us? There are two ways of funding the deficit, either by printing in Lebanese pound or by borrowing Eurobonds in dollars. At one time, the biggest crime is that we borrowed with fixing the exchange rate at 40%. So effectively, we financed the whole political system by buying Lebanese pounds, switch from dollar to Lebanese pound, a year later switch from Lebanese pound to dollar at fixed exchange rate and fill their pocket. That, in our estimation, is about $30 billion, but nobody needs the real figure. Why am I saying this? This is the background to say that the politicians in Lebanon don't realize that the definition of a politician is a public servant, to serve the public. Here, politicians, they think that the public is made to serve them for their own. And without trying to claim that I know better than others or my colleagues, I'm privileged to be with them, the solution in Lebanon is not short of experts. Lebanon is not short of legislation. As much as I respect what my colleague Alain has talked about, educational system, how much we spend on EDL, and. So I don't claim that I know better than anyone else about what to do to resolve and to come out of the crisis. But technically, if Samir is asking, what is the solution technically? Assuming, which is a big assumption and doesn't exist, the first complexity of the solution is that we want to create solutions under the leadership of politicians who create the problems. So this is impossible. People think this is simple. We have no MPs. We have no ministers. All the political system is summarized by 6 or 7 people. And the 6, 7 people, you can also sum down to 3 people, maybe 4 now. And those 4 can decide yes or no. So if we assume one day that they will wake up, their conscience will wake up, there are 3 fronts. One is budget deficit. One is balance of payment or current account. Because, as we said, we have a huge importation, no productivity in the country. And this cannot only be done now with stability of the Lebanese pound, because effectively a devaluation of the Lebanese pound does not help my export base. This country is non-productive. So I look at the pound similarly as I look at the lira. The only risk of what's happening in the budget deficit is that the printing is enlarging, inflating tremendously the money supply in lira, which eventually will put further down the line, will put more pressure on, as Youssef said, the traumas or the nightmares, where there'll be more and bigger money supply of lira demanding dollars, which will be in limited supply in case deposits in dollars don't go up, and it could lead to immediate collapse of confidence, which is, let me emphasize, confidence is the only thing that's still now maintaining stability in Lebanon. If there was no confidence, Lebanon would have collapsed 20 years ago. So, and that's what brought the deposit. So those tackling the deficit, tackling the trade, which could be done through reviewing all the our trade treaties, and also try to review our customs system, whereby we encourage importation from countries where we can impose more customs, and try, if we can, not to have treaties with countries that have dual trade, relationship with. And thirdly, is to create a debt management unit under the supervision of Central Bank and Ministry of Finance, but really run by professionals who have experience in managing debt, so that we maintain what the Central Bank has done so far good. But even the Central Bank, with all respect, its ability is limited if the politicians don't wake up. So the budget deficit, which is very quickly, again, it's no nuclear science. Alain spoke about it, politicians speak about it, everybody knows. EDL, and I agree with Alain 100%. If anybody is fooled that oil and gas is going to bail us out, I think that will be the crime of the century. Because this means not only that we have abused all our financial system, and we have misused almost to the level of stealing deposit of the individuals, the poor guy, the electrician, the mechanic, who have their deposit in bank because they think their money is safe. We are continuously, if our debt now is 80 official, okay, even if Lebanon does not collapse and go to 100, from 80 to 100, it's people's money. It's not coming from BlackRock and Blackstone and JP Morgan Emerging Market Fund. It's coming from people's deposit. Those people deserve better than that. So the deficit has to be tackled, and there are 4 or 5 items. I just spoke today to one of the leaders of MP, Takattul Niyabi, big, they have about 15, and he agreed with me. He said,
We know who they are.
15 kilos.
We're talking about customs, control customs. We're talking about a minimum of billion. We're talking about EDL. We talk income tax. We have TVA avoidance, or manipulating and maneuvering around it, and political reform from Marfa, Jumruk, Suklin, you name it. Accordingly, I could go on and on, because this is the story I live all my life, is the public debt, and we can resolve it. We can still contain it. I remind all that our debt is 2/3 in lira, 1/3 in pound. Our deposit is the opposite, so we can still contain it. The only thing that, in order to really resolve Lebanon and bring it out of its current situation, not to create more confidence by raising debt and hoping to raise deposit. What if deposits don't raise? You have to remember, Lebanese in the Gulf are no longer transferring as they did. Africa is almost all the currencies in Africa, and we have businesses in Africa. Across the board, currencies in Africa are down by 100% devaluation, so Lebanese in Africa are hardly hit. And real estate sector here is hardly hit. Plus, we have no FDI, we have no Gulf people coming. So we have to really be responsible. Who do you talk to? All I say, with everyone help, talk to everyone you can. Talk to your politician, raise the voice, and say, Lebanon will collapse if nothing is done in the coming 2 years. Do I think that Lebanon will not? Yes, Lebanon can and cannot collapse, but if we have a totally different kind of politicians. The political system we have and the politicians are literally corrupt. The system is corrupt, and the conclusion I say, the citizen has become corrupt.
Thank you, Hassan. I'm glad, though, that there is a window of opportunity for us to reform. We have at least 2 years to go. But, you know, on his side remark, Hassan, prior to 1975, Lebanon had fantastic financial stability. Was the politicians different?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, there were...
Of course, they were
not corrupt.
They were corrupt in
less
retail.
corrupt.
Now they are corrupt wholesale.
Ah, okay. So I just wanted to have this causal relationship, negative relationship between politicians.
The politicians in the old time didn't know what a million
stability.
is. Now they won't talk to you except in millions.
But sure, I mean, I think the whole idea here is to see how we can really reform, how to push for reform, and I agree with you. We should try as citizens, responsible citizens, to try to press in that direction as much as we can, and I think we can do it. Before I open the floor, are there any comments that you would like to make? Leila.
I just want to mention that this whole lecture will be posted on YouTube. If you know anyone who missed the lecture, it will be posted on YouTube. Better yet, for all Facebookers, please log on to Facebook, look up our page, AUBIFE, like it, so you can get the announcements for future events. And I guess now we can open the floor to questions. Thank you all so much. Dr. Bifani.
Thank you, Leila. I think I'm going to open the floor by just giving the chance to Alain Bifani to say a few words on, as a commentary on what Hassan said. Go ahead.
Just to clarify that the Debt Management Office exists. It has been created a few years ago at the Ministry of Finance. It is very highly represented today by Dr. Hassan Hamdan, Mrs. Bassem Antonios, and their staff. And they are actually doing an absolutely great job, which explains why the management of the debt and the cost of the debt servicing is improving. And they are working very closely with our colleagues at the central banks, just for clarification.
Youssef?
Yes, I mean, of course, Dr. Hassan knows it. But we are in the context of a stable currency. But, you know, when interest rates reached nearly 40%, it was on the Lebanese lira side of the equation. It's a small clarification, not the dollars.
Yeah,
Okay.
I said also switch from dollar to lira,
yes,
make 40% and bring it back to dollar.
Now, can I say a word about remittances? Or you want me to?
Briefly,
Yes,
because
yes,
I want
yes.
to give the floor to
I think this is a very important element of the equation. Of course, Lebanon's remittances to GDP are the highest. No, we all know that. But, Mike, yeah, sure. The issue of remittances is quite subtle and interesting to consider. That is, the diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora, is so spread out geographically. It is, as Dr. Hassan said, in the Gulf, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas. And this diversification smoothen out the inflow of capital. You want to compare Lebanon to Mexico? I mean, what do you say? If the U.S. sneezes, Mexico gets a flu. So this has always sustained a return. And some of our diaspora lives in Africa or in the Gulf and do not see the future of the children in those countries, okay, for education, for living, for the retirement. And that's why they send more money, by the way, than those migrants in Europe or the US. So this has sustained a more or less reliable inflow of capital. And that's why we as Lebanon need to project confidence, need to project a stable currency, need to project, more importantly, a stable banking system, and more importantly, a responsible political class, as Hassan was saying. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm opening the floor now. I'm going to take 3 first comments or queries. So I'll start with you. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you. Hello, my name is Hidea Farah. I'm the commercial attaché of the German embassy. So first, let me say thank you very much for these presentations. I learned a lot. I'm quite new here in this country. I'm only here for 2 months. And I have to say I enjoy it very much. And I'm also following political affairs with lots of interest. So what I have seen now that as of last Thursday, you speak of a budget deficit. At least as of last Thursday, you have a budget. So as a foreigner, and as I said, I looked into politics here, I find this quite impressive because, I mean, as you can read it in the news, there was no budget law for the last 12 years. So I would be highly interested you know, to have your assessment on how important is this political step and how much confidence will it actually convey to the diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question to Mr. Bifani.
I'm sorry, can you state your name and for the record? Can you state your name?
Yes, I'm Musa Fraji, an investor. Now, you mentioned amongst the various problems, the unemployment as a problem to be solved. You mentioned the production sector, productivity, or productive sectors, how to, and then, of course, you mentioned the trade deficit. Can you give us an idea how are you going to solve all those problems under the present protection, let's say, globalization that the country is following?
Henry, here. Let's have
Henry Azam, I am Professor of Finance at OSP here at AUB. Thank you, gentlemen, for excellent presentations. I would like to raise one issue. Why don't we consider lengthening the maturity profile of our debt? If Argentina defaulted 4 times the last time in 2014, issued 100-year bond yielding 8.75%. Jordan just a few days ago issued 30-year bonds yielding 7.25%. Why don't we go into much longer maturity? Let's delay the inevitable if there is inevitable, as Hassan is saying. So this would be one possibility. And I really want to hear from you, what's the nightmare scenario? I mean, what keeps you awake at night? Other than the one we talked about.
Predicting the future.
I know him, but I cannot say it publicly.
Thank you. I'm going to take this first round. I'll come back to you. I want to take this first round, give the panelists a chance to respond briefly. Alain.
Thank you, Dr. Makdissi. Very briefly, first on the budget issue, it is, of course, extremely important that we have a budget. It's not a detail because it reflects the fact that the institutions are coming back on track. This is not the ideal budget that we would have dreamt of. We are not yet under circumstances where we can show a nice deficit and we can show nice figures throughout the budget, but at least it exists, which is enormous. And at some point in time, a couple of years ago, I remember when we used to say that our constitution was becoming totally meaningless because we had no president, we were holding no elections, we didn't have a budget, we don't have accounts, etc., etc. Well, now all of this is coming into order. And the fact of having the 2017 budget now, even if October 2017, is at least putting the financial cycle in Lebanon back on track. So in terms of confidence, it is extremely important. And the fact that the 2018 budget is also moving quickly and that we're hoping that finally we will have a budget at the beginning of a year or even before is something of great importance. Coming back to financial orthodoxy doesn't come with a magic wand. It is one step after the other, and this is definitely one very important step. In terms of coming back to productivity and jobs, it is true that Lebanon is in a difficult position if we look at the dynamics in the world and if we look at the Middle East itself and we as part of the Middle East. But we are also witnessing competitive advantages that are coming back in Lebanon's way recently because of what is happening in the Gulf area, because of the developments in Africa. And very simply, if we want to achieve productivity, there is at least a few things to secure. The first is governance, a high level of governance, which is very important for investors, especially in a situation where it is difficult to start. Second, it's very important to have the infrastructure in place. I'm talking about the physical infrastructure, and we have to do it quickly because the human infrastructure is still there, which is a big advantage compared to a lot of countries in the neighborhood. Not to mention that, as I said, it is important for us and for our youth to be confident and stay in Lebanon, even if they have jobs. We need to secure the safety nets in an appropriate manner. How do we do that? Well, we do that with shifting from spending on things that are concentrating wealth to things that are of general good, among which, of course, the few infrastructure that are needed. I'm not talking about billions and billions to be spent. I'm just talking about the immediate essential issues that Lebanon needs to unleash its potential. And you would be surprised to know that on the safety nets front, sometimes by widening the coverage, by increasing the coverage, we can still save money compared to the situation in which we are. And I mean, I'm not going to go into details, but this is true at least in social security and end of service indemnities. On the issue of the debt and the lengthening, we have been significantly and sustainably lengthening the maturity of the debt. We have issued a 20-year Eurobond, a 20-year maturity Eurobond last year at 7.5%, and that was a first time in Lebanon's history, and we're going to continue to do that. This is on the dollar front. On the Lebanese pound, we are issuing for 10 years now. There is room for more, but for the time being, the 10 years are doing very well, and this has come very quickly after the 7 years, because you may remember that like 10 years ago, we were still issuing a maximum of 2 years for Lebanese pounds. And what we're seeing now on the market is an enormous appetite for the long maturities in Lebanese pounds, because as you know, our banks are looking for yields much more than anything else, and therefore they're finding it very attractive. Thank you.
Thank you. Youssef.
No, I mean, Alain has done the clarification about the
Hassan, you want to
tenors.
say anything?
But let me add something.
Okay.
On the tenors, we at the central bank issue products for 30 years. So, but it has been gradual. Okay.
I have no comment except what my colleague said, but for the German diplomat, I would like to, since you are new, and I know you asked your question innocently about is this an improvement, and our colleagues have said, yeah, Alain said it's a great improvement. Unfortunately, I'm not compromising on this. No, it's not an improvement. The fact that we issued a budget in October 2017, when 2017 has still only 6 or 8 weeks to go, that's not an achievement. And our hope is that we do have finally a budget in 2018, and I hope the Europeans, including yourself, and I know I'm not accusing you, God forbids, that you asked with bad intention. I know you asked innocently, but I hope you maintain that Lebanon should adapt the European standards by saying, is this a big step that is positive that we have a budget? No. Lebanon was ahead of the whole world in managing its finances. We have some of the best expertise in the world. It's to have a budget since 2005 for the first time is not an achievement. It is a sign of the corruption of the system. So that doesn't mean, oh, we should be positive and look at it. Okay, at least there is a start. I'm not optimistic that this is a start.
Thank you, Hassan. I'll take a second round, please. Go ahead.
Raji Khouri, an alum. Question to the central bank regarding the fixed exchange rate. Don't you think it invites some speculators reminiscent of the Black Wednesday crisis in the UK? Doesn't that worry you that it might happen? Another thing about the central bank becoming sort of like a hedge fund, so owning the Middle East Airlines, Banque du Liban. Isn't it time the central bank lets go of these assets and release them to the market and create some private shareholder value?
Thank you. You change your mind? Okay. Yes, there's a question there.
Hello, Edward Abu Jawd, UB alumnus and a student of Dr. Khalil. I now work for Middle East Airlines. Beautiful panel, by the way, thank you. I just wanted to ask, can Lebanon ever partake in a debt restructuring or debt forgiveness program? And if not, why not?
A third question? No. Okay. Nasser.
Hello, Dr. Makdissi. Hello, Mr. Khalil. Everybody. I just have a quick question regarding the debt, the composition of the debt. the part of the Lebanese that's held by the central bank, by the government. If everybody just trying just to speculate against the lira, and I'm just thinking about how much the central bank is willing or have an asset away aside from the gold, because nobody will sell gold and defend something nominal. Aside from the gold, and after the two swaps, how much the central bank is having like a foreign reserve, a foreign exchange reserve to defend. Let's say that if there was like a coordination method that everybody is willing to just drop his debt in Lebanese and then swap it and buy dollars in this way. Thank you very much.
Okay, Alain?
Thank you. I'm going to leave the details to Youssef, but just on the issue of the debt restructuring and the debt forgiveness, as my colleagues said, it is critical for Lebanon in such difficult circumstances to maintain confidence for investors. Of course, when we start enumerating all of the problems of Lebanon and describing the fact that everything is going wrong, it becomes very difficult to talk about confidence. But the confidence that we're talking about now is the fact that investors feel comfortable that the money that they're putting in Lebanese paper is going to be reimbursed plus interests. And this is precisely why Lebanon has never wanted to go into any kind of debt restructuring or even forgiveness, because it becomes more or less the same. But what Lebanon has had that doesn't really look like restructuring, but that is a significant push, an exogenous push, are the donors conference that every now and then we talk about. We may remember that in Paris too, for instance, a couple of billions were injected in the Lebanese system, a little bit more a few years later, and now we're again talking about the donors conference. This is another kind of non-market pushes that are given to the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Alain. Youssef?
Yes, precisely. And that's the point. And, you know, it portrays confidence, the fact that on so many occasions the international community has been present to assist Lebanon in our times. Of course, we should never build on that. This is very dangerous. It would be very dangerous to say, well, it happened yesterday, it will happen tomorrow, but to remind us. And there has been non-market interventions at very cheap rates, sometimes at 0% coming to support Lebanon in the past. And one has to admit that the Lebanese in general think this would happen or might happen if those things. But with time, I think the answer is the structure of the banking system, the solvency, the capitalization is higher than ever, okay? Still, as we all, I think, agree on this table, confidence could be sparkled, loss of confidence could be sparkled so easy. Now, why did we opt for the stability of the Lebanese lira? Remember our history in the 80s. I recall well in the 80s, I mean, investment was decreasing continuously, and financial activity or economic was speculating against the Lebanese pound. You know, huge funds were always allocated to speculate against the Lebanese lira, and I might say it was somehow an easy task to undertake. So very little was allocated for other projects or other interests. So we think we opted for a stable anchor, so that speculators or economic financial wealth sources would put this variable aside, not focus on this variable and forget on different things. And I think it worked well. Plus, this issue, we're not here. It will be, I think, the subject of another. I think a sound political discourse or a sound economic policy suggestion cannot but address very seriously in Lebanon the issue of the distribution of income and the distribution of wealth. This has been on a more and more concentrated level. And if you come to think of it, and I don't want to monopolize, if you wish, the intervention, the depreciation of the currency would hit those on pension, small level incomes, small depositors, We can talk about that later, but it's one of the deficiencies of our political system that discounts so easily on matters on that, as it discounts on matters of the environment. No modern political discourse would say I have an economic policy without addressing the environment. But this is, are we a hedge fund because we own, yes, we own the Middle East Airlines and we own Casino du Liban, or a part, very, very modest part of Casino du Liban. For you to know, since you also work with the Middle East Airlines, that our intention has been for several years to privatize it. And we consult with international financial advisors. And it's been the case that for the last 3-4 years, and even before, that this is not the proper time. It wasn't our own reading necessarily of the situation, but those consultants that we prepay to take their opinion into consideration and appraise it highly. That restructuring, and Alain had a wonderful answer to it. Now, this issue of collusion among big depositors in order to speculate against the Lebanese lira. Well, the two, if you wish, ways we counter that is our accumulation of foreign reserves. This is one. Second, the long tenor of deposits in Lebanese liras and in dollars. So banks are not into the interest to speculate against the lira when the deposits in Lebanese lira go for 30 years. They would hit their own, if you wish, net worth. So the combination of the time period of investment and the accumulation of foreign reserves both work hand in hand to hedge against that risk. We have an equation, internal equation. What if 70% of Lebanese liras convert into dollars? We can afford, yeah. I'm not necessarily saying the exact figure, but very high levels, if you wish, of share of deposits.
Thank you, Youssef. I think the time is, we have to close. Hassan, do you have anything to say? Because I have to close the session.
But, just for the gentleman who's talking about collusion, I think there is a difference between convertibility and between speculation. Somebody who owns lira can convert. Speculation, the central bank has taken all measures possible not to allow any bank to facilitate its clients to speculate without owning physically the Lebanese lira. So speculation is out of question. Converting is possible, and Youssef answered. But also about the restructuring, let me remind you, no restructuring or forgiveness can take place on any debt. There is no precedent I'm aware of, unless I'm wrong, except during a crisis. Nothing happens voluntarily. And hopefully we never get to that level. We can still prevent a crisis, assuming that we adopt all what we have said during this session.
Let me just close by saying that obviously what we have learned is that the focus of our monetary fiscal policy is to create stability and to create the conditions for stability, and that we know what ought to be done. At the same time, I think it's the responsibility for all of us to press our political class, our politicians, to really move in this direction to ensure that this will be the case. Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists for excellent presentations, and thank you all for participating. Thank you very much. Thank you.
An announcement, I think, Dr. Fadi.
Please help yourselves to coffee, tea, and pastries before you leave.